It's good to be with you. My name's James Kephart. If you don't know me, I used to be on staff here a couple years ago, but I'm the pastor out at Highland Community Church, and so I'm excited to be with you this morning. Pastor Joe and I had met a couple months ago, and our church has been talking about a church plant for a while, and so Joe and I got the idea of swapping pulpits. So this morning he's over preaching at Highland Community Church, and I get to be with you, and so they get the better end of the deal. But I'm glad to be here with you, and they're praying though for you. And what are y'all laughing at? Yeah, they're praying for Westside Church though. We're looking to do a church plant in Natchez in the fall, and Westside Church is a huge partner in that, and you're partnering with us. And I know Pastor Elias will share more details as going forward, but I'm excited for that. And so they're praying for you guys right now. Our services are 8:30 and 10:30, and so they're just starting to meet right now, and they're praying for you guys as being a partner in that. And so. But Luke chapter 9 is where we're at this morning. As somebody asked me this week that knew I was coming, that said, "Are you excited to come back to Westside and preach?" And I said I was, and asked how I felt about it. And I said I felt like a college kid that goes to college and then he gets to come home for Christmas. So it's good to be with you. Let's look at Luke chapter 9, verse 37. Let's go ahead and stand and read this together. We're picking up from where Pastor Joe left off. Verse 37, we're going to read down to the verse 50. The next day, when they came from the mountain, a large crowd met him. And a man in the crowd called out, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son, for he is my only child. A spirit seizes him, and he suddenly screams, and it throws him into convulsions, so that he foams at the mouth, and it scarcely ever leaves him, and is destroying him. And I begged your disciples to drive it out, but they could not." "You unbelieving and perverse generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you and put up with you? Bring your son here." And even while the boy was coming, the demon threw him to the ground in a convulsion, but Jesus rebuked the impure spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father, and they were all amazed at the greatness of God. And while everyone was marveling at all that Jesus did, he said to his disciples, "Listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men." But they did not understand what this meant. It was hidden from them, so that they did not grasp it, and they were afraid to ask him about it. And an argument started among the disciples as to which of them would be the greatest. And Jesus, knowing their thoughts, took a little child and had him stand beside him. And then he said to them, "Whoever welcomes this little child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. For it is the one who is least among you all who is the greatest." "And Master," said John, "we saw someone driving out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he's not one of us." And Jesus said, "Do not stop him, for whoever is not against you is for you." Father, I'm grateful just for another day, Lord. I'm grateful for the sunshine. I know everybody, I think, going through winter, you long for that sunshine and to have this warm weather we've had, Lord. But God, it's a reminder to me of your goodness to us. And you're such a good God. And Lord, as we look at your text this morning, here in Luke, and we look at the example that you've given us, God, I pray that you'll help us to help it to reshape our hearts and our minds, Lord, to be on mission with you and not necessarily on our own missions, God. And we just give you the glory, and I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, you can be seated. But as we go through this morning, one of the things I want you to understand here of what's happening is that you've got the disciples, and then you've got Jesus here, and they're both on mission, but I think what you see here is they're on two different missions, and they have different goals in these missions. And so there's two events that have impact on the disciples and on Jesus' mindset that they have during this time. And I think as we go through, you'll understand more. But at the beginning of chapter 9, there was something that happened. Jesus sends out his 12 disciples with a new power and a new authority that they've never had before. They can now cast out demons, and they can now heal people supernaturally. And so the purpose of having this power and this authority that Jesus gave them was so that they could proclaim the gospel. And so the disciples went from village to village to village, and they would preach the gospel of Jesus, and they would heal people, and people would bring their sick people or those, whatever the problem is, they bring them to the disciples, and the disciples can now do what Jesus had been doing. And so the experience for the disciples, man, they're on cloud nine. Like to be able to watch Jesus do all of that, and now Jesus gives them the ability and power to do it. I mean, they're excited. They're on cloud nine for being able to do that. And not only are they excited about this, but what happens to them is, I think, very much something that happens to all of us. And that's that our ego starts to grow a little bit. And I think their ego is growing, and it's getting a little bit bigger. There's not a whole lot of room in the room for their heads here. And Jesus, during this time, he's gained a lot of popularity. And so in their minds right now, they're performing miracles, and people are coming to them for help. And they're part of that inner circle of Jesus. And not only that, with the popularity that Jesus is gaining, like this is really like a high point in the ministry, because soon after this, what you see is that Jesus' ministry, he begins to gain less popularity and gain more enemies, you could say. And so this is like a peak in his popularity. And so everybody's coming to Jesus, and by doing so, they're also coming to the disciples. So the disciples are becoming really popular, so their ego's growing. And so I think this experience is going to play into the mindset that we're going to see here in the disciples. And the second experience or impact is on Jesus. Last week, Pastor Joe preached on the Mount of Transfiguration, from what I understand, and these verses before. And on the Mount of Transfiguration, you've got Peter, James, and John, and they get to go with Jesus up to this mountain, and they have this incredible experience where they see that Jesus' face is altered, and in being altered, they watch as he speaks with Moses and with Elijah. And I don't know how they knew it was Moses and Elijah, but somehow they know this is Moses and this is Elijah, and he's speaking with them, and he's having a conversation with them. And not only that, but then the presence of God just envelops Jesus. And they hear the voice of God. And that's a pretty awesome experience for Peter, James, and John. But for Jesus, this is probably more of a moment of restoration for Jesus. To understand what Jesus is going through and doing this ministry, I don't think we can fully grasp. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 5, it says that Jesus emptied himself and he took on the form of a servant. I've thought about this a lot lately, but what does it mean for Jesus to empty himself? Like, what did Jesus empty himself of? Have you ever thought about that? And I don't think we can fully know or understand this, but I think in one sense, Jesus gave up his glory. He gave up the adoration of saints and of angels in glory so that he can take on this form of a servant. Humanity. And he also gave up, though, a unique presence that he had within the Trinity, with God the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Recently, I preached in John chapter 17. At the beginning of this, Jesus is praying to God the Father. And one of the prayer requests that Jesus has is, Father, I want to be back in your presence like it was before the world existed. And so you see this desire in Jesus to be back in that close, intimate communion that he has with God the Father and with the Holy Spirit. There's a strong desire. And so I think it's hard for us to understand, but Jesus in this moment, he's longing for that. 1 Corinthians 13 says that we see in part and we know in part, but one day we're going to see face to face, and we're going to be able to understand in ways that we don't understand now. And so for Jesus, this unique mountaintop experience is going to be invigorating to him. And it's going to be life-giving to Jesus. To continue, it's so that he can continue the ministry and he can set his face towards the cross. Verse 31 says, Moses and Elijah speaking to Jesus, and it says they spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring fulfillment at Jerusalem. This is my opinion, but I believe the message to Jesus in this moment from Moses and Elijah was, Jesus, it's time to set your attention to the cross. Your hour is almost at hand, and it's time to start looking and heading that way. And so it's life-giving, and it's invigorating, and it's restoring for Jesus, but now he's preparing for the cross. And so for the disciples and for Jesus, these experiences are really play into the mindset that we see in them in these next few verses. Look at verse 37. It says, the next day, when they came down from the mountain, a large crowd met him. What you're going to see here is that Jesus and the disciples are not on the same mission at this point. But they're coming down from this mountaintop experience. And a week ago, our men at our church, we had a men's retreat up at Lazy F Ranch up in outside of Ellensburg. And 25 men went up there, and it was an awesome experience. I mean, we had an incredible time. We had competition. Men need competition. I don't know what it is, but at least I do. I don't know. And so we had all this competition, and we gave awards out. We had an award for the most gruesome injury, and we played basketball shirts versus skin, as I had a giant handprint on my chest, and it went away a few days later. But I didn't win the award. But we had a great time, and then we preached through the book of Habakkuk, and it's 3 chapters long. And the book of Habakkuk, to understand, Habakkuk prays and he says, God, I want you to answer my prayer, and I want you to answer it this way. God answers his prayer, but it's not the way he wants him to answer the prayer. And you get to the end of Habakkuk, and the whole message at the very end of chapter 3 is, though failure comes, though crops fail, though there's no animals in the stall, it says, I'm still going to celebrate the Lord, and I'm still going to live by faith. And so it's talking about going from a mountaintop experience to living in the valley. And when you live in the valley, you live by faith. And so the disciples here are coming down from a mountaintop experience, and Jesus as well. And they're going down into the valley here in Luke now. And they're going from having a lot of success to failure now. They're going to fail and not be able to do what God's called them to do here. And so what you understand here is that the disciples couldn't do it. Look at verse 38. A man in the crowd called out, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son, for he is my only child." And a spirit seizes him, and he suddenly screams. And it throws him into convulsions so that he foams at the mouth. And it scarcely ever leaves him, and is destroying him. And I begged your disciples to drive it out, but they could not. So this father comes to Jesus because the disciples could not do what needed to be done. And you hear this father, and I don't know if you hear the desperation in the father's voice here, but this father is desperate to see his son not suffer anymore. And he's desperate to see him not go through the struggle. And as a parent, one of the hardest things for us to do is to watch our children struggle. And you see them suffer, and you see them struggle, and there's nothing you want to do to take that away or to take their place, right? I recently met with a lady, and her son is struggling through drug addiction. And she talked about how it's destroying his life, and he's pushing away everybody in his life, and it's becoming a taking over his life, and it's just destroying him. And as I prayed with this lady, she prayed for her son, and you could hear the desperation in her voice. She was desperate for her son to be healed, and I see that desperation in this father. And he says, "Master, Jesus, I beg you, look at my son." I picture this man fighting through the crowd, pushing people as he's going through, trying to get up to the front where Jesus is. And he gets there, and I imagine he falls at his knees and just cries, "Jesus, Master, I beg you, look at my son." And it says that this is his only son. And when we think of an only child in a family today, we might think of that child as being maybe a little bit spoiled, right? An only child. There's times growing up I wish I was an only child so I could get spoiled a little bit more. But I think in Jewish culture, it's a lot more than that. It's incredibly important for a man to pass on his ancestral line, and to have a boy to do that was really important. And not only that, there's an economic impact. There's no one to take care of this father when he grows old, because they didn't have Social Security, and they didn't have a retirement home down the road. The way they took care of him was their children took care of him. That's the way it worked in this culture. And so it was a big deal. This was his only son. And the disciples were unable to heal him. The father tells Jesus, "I went to your disciples first, and they tried to, but they couldn't do it." And I think in the minds of the disciples, there's probably a little bit of embarrassment, right? Jesus gave them the tools and says, "Here's the job to go do," and they're unable to accomplish that job, and perhaps they're afraid of maybe disappointing Jesus. But you have to ask, why couldn't they perform this miracle? What are the reasons, right? They had the tools. Jesus said you could do it, but what are the reasons that they couldn't perform this one and heal his son? The father believed that they could heal his son, and he knew about their previous mission. I think that it says at the beginning of the chapter, the disciples went from village to village doing this. And I imagine he was in one of those villages, and the disciples came to the village. And as they came to the village, he watched as Jesus healed other people's kids and other people's children. But when it came to his son, they couldn't do it. And so this father does what we should all do, but he goes to Jesus. Matthew and Mark give us some insight as to why they could not heal him. And when you read Mark's account of this miracle, it records Jesus calling this spirit or this demon a mute and deaf spirit. And for whatever reason, the spirit couldn't speak and the spirit couldn't hear. And we don't know any more than that. But Mark also records the disciples coming to Jesus after the miracle and saying, "Father," or "Jesus, why couldn't we heal this man's son?" And Jesus gave them a couple reasons, but the first one he says is because this type of spirit's only driven out by prayer and fasting. And the disciples, have become really busy with ministry at this point. They're doing a lot of really good things and really great things. They're doing what they're called to do. But I think when we become real busy, and even when it's ministry, even when it's really good things, sometimes we become so busy that we forget about abiding in the vine, about going to the source, the one that gives us the strength and the ability to do what we do and to continue to serve in the mission that we've been called to do. I can become really busy with ministry. And I get busy doing these good things, and they're great. But I forget to abide and go to that one and the one that gives me my source and to have that time in prayer. And I don't know about you, but I don't know what your time looks like, but we need that time. And we need to be connected to get the source and the strength that we need to continue every day, because honestly, the mission is not easy. The mission's hard at times. Matthew also records another reason that he tells his disciples, and he says to his disciples when they ask, he says, "It's because of your little faith." And I think as we get into the rest of the story in Luke, we're going to understand a little more about what's going on in the minds of the disciples. The disciples had this gift given to them by Jesus, but this father can't trust or depend on the disciples. And he goes to Jesus. And that's who he should go to. And that's who the disciples should have gone to when they couldn't do it, is they should have gone to Jesus. And it's true for us. is that when people fail us, because they do, I've told my church this many times, is that if you're depending on me, just wait a little bit and I'll disappoint you. Just give it a little bit of time, because eventually I'm going to disappoint you. But you know what? Jesus is not going to disappoint, and he's always the one that we can go to. And this man, this father, had the faith to know that even though the disciples couldn't do it, Jesus could heal his son. Verse 41, you unbelieving and perverse generation, how long shall I stay with you and put up with you? Bring your son here. What we understand here is that Jesus could do it. When the disciples could not do it, Jesus could do it. And who is Jesus talking to, though? I wrestled with this week. When he says, you unbelieving and you perverse generation, I wrestled with who is he talking to. And I read where one said he's talking to the disciples, and another said he's talking to the Father, and one said he's talking to the crowd. And I think the answer here is that Jesus is talking to everyone here. He's talking to the disciples because they still don't get it. In their minds, they're not seeing Jesus as the suffering servant. In the same chapter, verse 21, Jesus told them, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, teachers of the law, and he must be killed. They're not seeing the bigger mission that Jesus is on. And so he's also talking to the crowd when he says, you unbelieving and perverse generation. The crowd's not made up of only people that are excited about the miracles of Jesus, although there are a lot of people that are excited. But we find in the other Gospels that there's teachers of the law here, and there's skeptics in the crowd that are looking for a sign from Jesus. Jesus, if you really are the Messiah, I want you to prove it to me. Right? They're looking for enough evidence that's going to give them the satisfaction. The nation that Jesus came to, the Jewish nation, was constantly saying, show me a sign. And when I'm convinced to my satisfaction, and when I have enough evidence, then I'll believe you're the Messiah, Jesus. And Jesus tells them, you faithless generation, you don't lack evidence, you lack faith. And I see that Jesus is also talking to the Father when he says this. Mark chapter 9, verse 23, records more of this conversation that he has with the Father. And he makes a statement to the Father in verse 23, and he says, everything is possible for the one who believes. He says, if you believe, if you have the faith, everything is possible. We understand Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ. We understand that, and it's the same that you believe in the one who has the source and the ability, anything's possible. And then that conversation, the Father responds to Jesus, and he says, I do believe, but help my unbelief. And you hear those two statements, and they're like two statements that don't go together. On one hand, I believe Jesus. I believe you have the power. But on the other hand, help my unbelief. And those are statements that clash together, but really they don't. Because what you have here is that both faith and unbelief or doubt reside in this Father's heart. And I know I've been there, and perhaps you've been there. You've had seasons of doubt where you question God, and you're struggling to trust what he's doing. You're struggling to trust that he is who he says he is in your life right now. But I'm grateful that those seasons of doubt and those questions, they're not too big for God. And he's not afraid of them, and he can handle them. And guess what? This Father, when he's struggling with belief and unbelief and they're clashing together, he goes to Jesus and he says, help my unbelief. And that's what we should do too. We should go to the one that can help our unbelief. In verse 42, even while the boy was coming, the demon threw him to the ground in a convulsion. But Jesus rebuked the impure spirit, and he healed the boy, and he gave him back to his father. And they were all amazed at the greatness of God. The Son of the Father is following behind him. As the Father's going up to the crowd to Jesus, the Son's following behind. And in this moment, it seems like the Son is in his right mind and he's not being controlled by the Spirit. And then all of a sudden, as he approaches Jesus, everything the Father has told Jesus is true. And that Spirit takes over and he flays to the ground and he convulses. And Jesus is seeing all of this. The other Gospels tell us that the Father, when he spoke to Jesus, he told him that there's times when this would happen and he'd throw himself into water or he'd throw himself into fire, like he's trying to kill him. And so you can understand the fear that this father has of losing his son. And Jesus does two things here. First, he rebukes this unclean spirit. He commands the spirit to leave and never come back. And secondly, you see that he heals the boy. And perhaps this boy's body was broken down. The Father said in verse 39 that the boy was being destroyed. And if you can imagine, to constantly go through what he's going and to be just all of a sudden and to throw your body on the ground and convulse, he's probably got injuries and his body's probably broken down, but Jesus heals him wholly. And he picks him up and he returns the boy to the Father. Can you imagine the testimony of this father? When people ask him about Jesus, he says, I met Jesus and I know Jesus. And Jesus, he healed my son. And not only that, but Jesus saved me. And that becomes the testimony of this father. And everywhere he go, I imagine, this is my speculation, but everywhere he goes, I imagine that he's telling people about this experience with Jesus. And when he came to know Jesus, and there's skeptics out there that would doubt it. But this man didn't care about the skeptics because he was there. And he knows what Jesus did in his life. And how many of us have that same testimony? How many of us can share that same testimony with others? There's an old gospel song that Johnny Cash made famous a long time ago. So if you're like under 40, don't pay any attention to this. You probably won't know what I'm talking about. But Johnny Cash in this song, he says, there are some people who say we cannot tell whether we are saved or whether all is well. They say we only can hope and trust that it is so. But I was there when it happened. Well, and I guess I ought to know. I guess there's just young people in this room. That's okay, right? But I was there when it happened, and I guess I ought to know. But that was the testimony of this father. He was there, and nobody's going to make him deny or say differently. And it says there that they were all amazed at the greatness of God. Man, they looked at what Jesus did, and people are astonished by what they saw. Surely this is the greatness of God on display. And what we are seeing is God coming down from heaven. But while they're being astonished, you see something else that's happening with Jesus' disciples and in their minds and hearts. And Jesus is going to remind them that there's a greater mission than just performing miracles. Because Jesus did not come to perform miracles. Jesus came for a mission that's much greater and better than that. And the mission that Jesus came for is an eternal mission. It's not a temporal mission. Look at verse 43. While everyone was marveling at all that Jesus did, he said to his disciples, listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. But they did not understand what this meant. It was hidden from them so that they did not grasp it, and they were afraid to ask him about it. Jesus says, listen carefully. The words in the ESV says, let these words sink into your ears. Like, I want you to hear what I'm saying, disciples. And they're not going to understand it, but I need you to hear this. And he says, the Son of Man is coming. And they're going to understand it later. But right now, he wants them to hear that the Son of Man is going to be delivered like a prisoner into the hands of men. And so that statement, the Son of Man, is a prophetic term we find in Daniel chapter 7. And the Jews understood what this meant. They understood that the Son of Man meant to the Messiah that they were waiting for and they were looking for. And Daniel chapter 7 describes the Son of Man coming and ruling with dominion and with power and having all this great authority. But what it doesn't talk about is the Son of Man suffering. And Jesus is here talking about how the Son of Man's going to suffer. Before the transfiguration, verse 22, we read it. But it says, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. And he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. So for them to hear this, it doesn't line up with their eschatology. And so this, though, is the mission for which Jesus came. And it wasn't about performing the miracles, but it was about the greater mission. And I wrote this down, and I want to read it just so I don't mess it up. But here's the mission. Jesus emptied himself. He took on the form of a servant, a human, and the purpose that he came was not to perform miracles. It wasn't to create a following or rule an earthly kingdom. He was born to die so that these disciples and the Jews in the crowd and this father and his boy and you and I would have an opportunity to not die in our sin, facing the consequence of sin, but allow Jesus to become our substitute, to pay the price for our sin, to satisfy justice in the eyes of God so that we would not spend eternity apart from God, but with a God who loves us beyond our comprehension. You know what we call that? We call that the gospel. And that's the mission that Jesus came for. The gospel was the mission, and it was an eternal mission that's vying for the souls of men and women, boys and girls of humanity, so that they want to be separated from him, but they get to spend eternity with him. This was the mission, and that's the mission Jesus is on. But the disciples' mission, you're going to see, is a temporary mission. It's a temporal mission. Verse 46, an argument started among the disciples as to which of them would be the greatest. And Jesus, knowing their thoughts, took a little child and had him stand beside him. And then he said to them, whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. For it is the one who is least among all who is the greatest. And here's where we see the difference between the mission that Jesus is on and the mission the disciples are on. Because Jesus is on a mission to redeem the souls of men and women for all eternity. But they're on a mission to really climb the ladder of success in the administration of Jesus. They're thinking Jesus is going to be the next king in Jerusalem. And he is, but not in the way that they're thinking, because their mission and their perspective is very temporal. Next week is Palm Sunday. As we, the church, the larger church, we understand what Palm Sunday is. That's the Sunday before Easter, right? But it marks that last week of Jesus, of his life and ministry on earth, before he goes into heading towards the cross and dying on the cross. And as Jesus is riding in on Palm Sunday, what we call Palm Sunday, he's riding in to Jerusalem. He's going on this road that goes from the Pool of Siloam, and it heads upwards towards the temple that's on the top of the mount there. And this last summer, I actually got to walk on this road. It was incredible. But there's a step there. In 2005, they actually had a flood in this neighborhood, and it washed out a bunch of stuff under the neighborhood, and they discovered the road that was still there and still intact. And I actually got to, they put these metal arches underneath, and so there's a neighborhood above, but you can walk underground on this road, the very road that Jesus walked on, and millions of Jews, and this is the road that he's riding up. And as he's riding up what's happening is that the Jews are singing these what's called songs of ascent. You see it in Psalms 118 to about 134, and they're songs that they sing when they're ascending to the temple during Passover. And Psalms 118, they're singing, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even our King of Israel. And they're singing this about Jesus, and they're taking palm branches, and they're laying them in front of Jesus as he's riding in on this donkey. And they're rightfully so declaring him the new King of Israel. But the problem is that he is not the king that they wanted. Because the king that they wanted was a king that was going to free them from Roman oppression and going to make them their own nation, no longer under Roman control. And it was going to free them from the religious oppression that they were experiencing. And he was going to be their new king right then and there. And the disciples have this in mind. And so they're arguing who's going to be greatest in his kingdom. And they're thinking, John saying, I'm going to be president or vice president. And maybe Peter's arguing and says, no, you should be Secretary of State. I'm going to be vice president. And they're having this argument about it. And Jesus, because he knows his thoughts, their thoughts, is going to take this opportunity to teach them what greatness is in his kingdom. And he has a little child standing beside him. And I imagine that he gently takes his hand and puts it on the shoulder of this little boy. And he tells him what greatness is. And he says, the one who is least among you is the greatest in my kingdom. Well, why does he use this little boy? Because to be great in his kingdom is not a position. And it's not because people are following you that makes you great, disciples. It's not because you could perform miracles and people are excited to see you. That doesn't make you great in my kingdom. But the one that's least is great. And so greatness is humility, and greatness is knowing who your strength and your ability all comes from. Because it doesn't come from you, disciples. And to take this little boy, this child in Jewish culture, a child was considered to be of the lowest status in culture. And so even a servant in a house had a higher status than a child would have. And Jesus takes who's lowest in the status of that culture, and he says, this is what greatness looks like. And you know what I think is in the heart of the boy? He wasn't concerned about his position and what he's going to do. He just wanted to be with Jesus. And I imagine the reason that little boy was there because he heard Jesus was there and he wanted to be with Jesus. He says that's what greatness is. One of the reasons the disciples are unable to heal this man's son, and I believe this is why you see this argument right after this miracle in Luke, is because what's happening is they're getting sidetracked with their own pride and their own prerogative of status and who am I going to be in this kingdom? And while this son of this father is on the sidelines over here being trashed and thrashed and his body destroyed, and they're unable to help, they're not concerned about, hey, let's take this boy to Jesus because if we can't do it, we know he can do it. They're concerned about their status in Jesus' kingdom. And then the next two verses further show the heart and mindset of these disciples. In verse 49, it says, Master, said John, we saw someone driving out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he's not one of us. Do not stop him, Jesus said, for whoever is not against you is for you. You know what they said? They said, this man doesn't go to our church, Jesus. He goes over to Highland Community Church, and he's not part of us. And at first glance, when you read this statement, it seems out of place. But what this comment does is further express the obliviousness of the disciples here, because they don't get it. Jesus just told them that their definition of greatness is wrong, and their response to him was, this man doesn't go to our church. The disciples see this man over here as a threat to their position. We're not concerned with what he's doing or who he is. All we know is he's doing it, and he's not one of us. And his name's not recorded here, but what I promise you is that Jesus knew exactly who that man was. And we don't see it, but perhaps Jesus had an encounter with him and Jesus gave him the ability, just like he gave it to the disciples. We don't know it, but Jesus knows exactly who this man is. And he says, it's okay because he's doing my work. And the disciples are concerned, but Jesus is not. And what you see through all of this, though, is that Jesus is guiding and he's shaping his disciples to get off of the mission that they're on and to get on the mission that Jesus is on. Because the mission that they're on is a temporary mission. And it's not going to last. The kingdom they think that they're building is not the same kingdom. But Jesus' kingdom is a permanent, eternal kingdom, and it's going to last forever. And so, in the same way, what Jesus does is he draws us into gospel living. And to have gospel living means to be mission-minded for Jesus' mission. And he's not condemning his disciples here, but rather what he's doing is he's reshaping their value system. He's shaping their life to be a life that's centered on the gospel. And the disciples' value system you see here is a value system of status and success and being number one, having a following, pride and power. But Jesus is reshaping that by drawing them into this eternal mission that he's on. The Son of Man is sent to die. That's the mission that Jesus is on, and they need to get on to that mission. And gospel living, that's what it does to us. It's the same thing as the process of sanctification that we're in. When we become a believer, God reshapes our mind and our thinking so that we stop thinking temporally and we start thinking eternally. Gospel living is generous. It is not self-serving, but it's serving, and it's loving. It's self-sacrificial, it's humble, it's purposeful. It serves the least and it values others over myself. And it has the attitude of John the Baptist when he said, I must decrease, but he must increase. Because gospel living makes our life all about Jesus. And when we start thinking that way, understand, eternity, this life that we live now, it's just a drop in the bucket in the light of all eternity. Because I promise you, you have years and centuries and thousands and millions of years ahead of you. And that's the kingdom that we're living for. But the kingdom now, it's a temporary kingdom. Tim Keller said this about the gospel. The gospel humbles you because Jesus had to die for you, but the gospel holds you close because Jesus wanted to die for you. When you realize that Jesus had to die for you, what it does is it breaks you. It breaks your heart. But when you realize he wanted to die for you, not only does it break you, but it restores you. And it renews you, and it humbles you, and it gives you a greater purpose and a greater kingdom to live for. And that kingdom that we're a part of, and one day we'll be able to fully experience forever, it should cause us now to live for that kingdom now. Not this kingdom that we're living in, but that kingdom that we're looking forward to. And the truth is, we're not much different than the disciples. I know I'm not when I look in the mirror. And we need our mission reoriented, and we need our value system to be shaped by the gospel mission. And so we're going to have a time of prayer. I understand this is part of the tradition. There's a couple prayer prompts here. And the first one is pray that God would help us to be mission-minded and gospel-centered. And perhaps today, maybe in your thinking, you're like me and you've gotten off course from Jesus' mission. And you just need to reorient. And you need to have your mind reshaped to his mission. Let's go to the one who can realign our mission, and let's spend some time in prayer right now. The second prayer prompt is I mentioned at the beginning that we're getting ready to do a church plant in Natchez. We're planning for the fall to launch this, and this is not just Highland Community Church. This is a partnership, and Highland's a huge partner in that. And so together, and along with a couple other churches, we're going to see a church planted, and we get to be a part of it. And I shared this with our church last week, and in doing so, I shared that we all have a part in it, whether we're sending or going or whether we're replacing those that are going in their places of service, but we all have a part. And so would you take a few moments and would you pray for the Natchez church plant and even pray for your part? But would you pray for that now? God, I'm so thankful that we get to be a part of your mission. Lord, you don't call us to the sidelines. But God, you call us all to be a part of the community that shares the gospel. Lord, you've given this mandate to the church, and we're the vehicle of the gospel, God, and what a privilege we have. And God, as I know, it's my own struggle at times, Lord, but my thinking is not always gospel-centered, and it's not always on the mission, but it's a temporal mission. God, I pray you'll reshape our thinking and our hearts today, Lord, to be on mission with you. And God, we lift up this work that you're doing, God, and how you've stirred in hearts, Lord, and for this church plant in Natchez. And I just pray, God, that you would provide and supply and lead and guide in every aspect, God, and that we would look towards you, Lord. I'm so thankful for Westside Church. Lord, not only the impact in my life, but God, the impact on the community, Lord, and help us together just to be a vehicle for the gospel. We're so thankful. We love you, Lord. We just pray this in Jesus' name.